Dave Hannigan, the author of The Big Fight When Ali Conquered Ireland. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Will. Glad to be here.
It's funny, I've always wanted to read this book, so when the opportunity arose to chat to you around its re-release, I put my hand up and said gladly, and it didn't disappoint. 7 days Ali was in Ireland, and it's the biggest compliment I can pay your book is that it reads like if someone was said, what would it be like if I wrote a novel about Muhammad Ali coming to Ireland and what would happen if he fought in Croke Park? And it's so vivid and colourful and packed so full of kind of different characters around him the whole week that it really is kind of hard to believe this all happened.
It is, and you know, it does look scripted in terms of like the supporting cast is just so ridiculously colourful. Rock Brenner, Yul Brenner's son, who was his bodyguard, who was like wearing earrings and long hair and a caftan and always carrying a guitar. Not much of a bodyguard, really. Paddy Monaghan, Ali's like closest friend in many ways in these islands, who was based in Oxford but was born in Ireland originally. He was kind of he was an unemployed hod carrier from England. You had Harold Conrad, the slick New York City promoter, Buddy Sugru, the circus strongman, who was called the strongest publican in captivity in London, where he ran pubs for a number of years. You know, there's just a list of people, and I couldn't believe when I first researched the book all those years ago, at every corner you'd meet somebody else and go, oh, I can't, but who is this guy? And then you delve into it, and then you get the backstory, and you'd say this is ridiculously rich material.
It's funny because I asked you before we kicked off, you know, the book originally came out in, I think, 2002, and obviously re-released 2025, and I just asked you why you did it, and it was more so that, like, the treasure trove of new material. I was surprised to learn how much you kind of changed or added from the original.
Yeah, I've been coming across stuff from when the book first came out. You know, a couple of months after that, we discovered the government released papers where De Valera was told that you should not have this man, Muhammad Ali, to visit Ars an Uachtaráin because he's a bombastic individual. And that, you know, that was the start of a long process where I just would keep hearing stories. And I'm going, I missed that. I did not get that the first time. And even down to Al Blue Lewis, who he fought, who was a tremendous character in his own right. And there was a wonderful story by Willie McGee, 4 Goals Willie McGee, the inter-county footballer in Garda, who told the story of he was on Ormond Quay in an unmarked police car, and Al Blue Lewis came jogging along, and Al Blue Lewis, he got out of the car to stop Al Blue Lewis because he just wanted to meet him, and Al Blue Lewis, who had a long criminal past, put his hands in the air because every time he'd ever met a policeman, he'd been arrested. But it was Willie McGee just wanting to interact with him and have a chat.
Yeah, so the book is packed full of that colour. But just to give some people, I guess, a little bit more context about where Ali was in his life at that time, because obviously people are pretty familiar with his life story, I'm sure. But so this was July of 1972 when he gets to Ireland. So 5 years earlier, in March 1967, he beat Sora Foley in Madison Square Garden by knockout. That extends his record to 29-0. He's the world champion. He's the biggest sports star in the world. And he doesn't fight again for the guts of 3.5 years until October 1970. His opposition to the Vietnam War, his refusal to be drafted, kind of led to him being refused a boxing license all over America. So 3.5 years at the height of his powers, he's sitting on the sidelines. By the time he came to Ireland then in July of 72, he'd been back in action for kind of a little under 2 years. He'd fought 9 times since then, winning 8. The only blemish being the fight of the century in 1971 against Joe Frazier. But, you know, reading the book, he's back in action, as I said, almost 10. It's going to be his 10th fight, but still kind of, I suppose, trying to re-establish himself. Maybe it was the defeat of Joe Frazier that kind of knocked him off the front of the marquee, but, you know, he had fought in Tokyo in the build-up. He'd fought in Zurich in similar kind of exercise that seemed to kind of spin some money. He's kind of in a strange place in his stardom, I guess.
Yeah, it's a very curious kind of, you know, interim, basically, slot in Ali's career. After the Frazier fight, everybody wanted a rematch except Frazier, right? Who you know, never wanted to fight Ali again, really. Now, they'd go on and fight the epics, obviously, in the future. But where he was he was fighting on every 4 to 6 weeks. He needed money. He needed to go to cities where he'd never been before, where he was a kind of a novelty and box office. His lifestyle was ridiculously extravagant. There was a lot of people being supported by Ali. So he was constantly fighting, constantly available to fight. So Buddy Sugru, the circus strongman turned publican, he got to Harold Conrad at a good time in Ali's career in terms of getting him to Dublin. But I also, you know, want to reiterate that this was not a washed up Ali. This was not Ali like in 1980. This was Ali with some of his greatest fights ahead of him, the Rumble in the Jungle, the Thriller in Manila, all of that was in the future. So he was still he was kind of recovering his prime, if you want to say, after the hiatus due to his fight with the American government. But he was, nowhere near washed up. They were great, great days ahead for him. So it was kind of a strange interim period.
Yeah, this was fight number 4 of an 8-month period that saw Ali fight 6 times. So that, I suppose, illustrates the money he needed, and to the point you made about Joe Frazier not wanting to fight him. So between their first 2 fights, Joe Frazier fought 4 times and Ali fought 13 times. So that illustrates, I guess, the different trajectories they were on or the busyness they were. And not to, I suppose, bring it to a downer right away, but when you see those numbers of fights and 6 fights in 8 months and knowing what comes later, you are kind of like, God, like it's kind of it makes for a kind of a sobering read in a book that's packed full of kind of jovial encounters. You kind of that kind of stopped me, and I made me think, oh, that doesn't sound good.
Well, I think this book is quite, because of the characters, not because of me, but because of the characters. It's a very funny book, and there's a lot of laughs. But then I actually wrote another book about Ali's last fight, The Drama in the Bahamas, which is a very grim and depressing tale for all the reasons that you outlined, because he had shipped so much punishment in the course of his career. He had fought so much. And one of the things I would like to point out is that he wanted to fight and he wanted to go to these places. He had a tremendous curiosity. He loved going places where he'd never been before. So Dublin was kind of a strange, exotic location.
Yeah, you mentioned the 2 promoters who I guess are the old school equivalent of what we'd see now of an Eddie Hearn or a Frank Warren trying to put together this super fight. You had this traditional boxing promoters you mentioned, and Harold Conrad, this kind of colourful Irish publican based in London who was a former strongman. They coalesced to bring Ali to Dublin, and I guess, as I mentioned in my intro, the fight probably didn't ultimately go as planned on the financial side, and you kind of get an idea as to maybe why that was when this odd couple kind of trying to pull the strings together.
Yeah, like a number of people who were involved in the background, like even Angelo Dundee said, like he didn't really think that Buddy Sugu realised what was involved in staging a boxing fight involving Muhammad Ali in a stadium, the costs, the logistics of it. And Buddy was basically chancing his arm. He was a tremendous entrepreneur, character. He was flamboyant. He was just ridiculously innovative in the stuff that he'd do. But he was a little bit out of his depth here. Like at one point he's in a flat in Sean McDermott Street, paying people out of a bin bag full of money. And as somebody said, the money was cash that still reeked of beer. It was straight from the tills, And then Harold Conrad was this slick Clark Gable lookalike character. I mean, all you need to know about Harold Conrad is Humphrey Bogart played the Harold Conrad character in The Harder They Fall, the movie written by Bud Schulberg.
Yeah, and it's funny, like you mentioned Sean McDermott Street there. One thing I like about this book, reading it during the week, obviously we're in Talbot Street right now. This is where the Indo office is, and there's so many of the locations around here. Like the picture of Muhammad Ali striding around these streets is kind of baffling to me.
And the Gresham was like the epicenter of fight week, if you want to call it that. And Ali was domiciled at Hopperman's out in the Dublin Mountains, and he hated that because that was way too far from the action. Whereas at the Gresham, everybody was milling around the Gresham. Everybody would come into town for the fight from America, from London, and Ali wanted to be there. And he loved walking down O'Connell Street and having people chant his name. That was kind of the lifeblood of the sporting experience for Ali. The adulation, the attention. He lived for that.
And was this the most, you would assume, that this would be like the most hyped sporting occasion in the history of the state? Like you have Muhammad Ali, as you say, with his best fights, some of the most iconic fights still ahead of him. Was it received like that? I was interested to read that, like, for a lot of the media, it was kind of, they were like waiting for him to almost step off the plane before they kind of were going to allow themselves to believe that this was actually going to happen.
Yeah, there was a lot of laughter when Buddy Sugu announced that he was going to bring Muhammad Ali to Dublin. It was the most outlandish, ridiculous proposal ever. And if when you sift through the newspaper archives from March 1972, April 1972, they are laughing, they are mocking, they're knocking great fun out of it. And then he arrives, with his full entourage, and they suddenly realize this is going to happen. And even Harold Conrad was shocked, because Harold Conrad's attitude was like, why are these people so against the idea of Ali coming to Dublin? Like, he's gold for journalists. Like, he'll provide copy every day, column inches. So it was a kind of a strange kind of, they had to put their hands in the wounds, basically, before they realized that this was going to be a real thing.
And like the scene when he arrives at Dublin Airport is kind of classically Irish. Like there's like a TD is like kind of makes himself known, just like kind of elbows his way to the front for a photo op. He's handed a shillelagh, that's how he pronounced it. It really is kind of a lot of fanfare when he gets to Dublin finally.
Yeah, and you know, Rockbrenner went to Trinity as an undergrad, and he basically had some experience of Ireland. So Rockbrenner's idea was they would all wear green blazers getting off the plane, so the Irish people would be happy. But when Ali gets in, he's like picking up the shillelagh, threatening to hit people with it. Gives a press conference in Dublin Airport where he's delivering the same old lines he's always delivered, but like it's fresh for an Irish audience, and it's just such a colourful event, such a kind of, you know, razzmatazz and kind of glamour about the whole thing, because he just radiated that. I mean, he looked fantastic in the first place. You know, he looked like a Hollywood idol, if you want to see that phrase, as much as an athlete.
It's funny, like you mentioned Joe Frazier and, you know, the first fight and him wanting to fight him again, and Joe Frazier not kind of acceding to that request initially, because the book is peppered with like pretty much every second thing he says is a dig at Joe Frazier, and I suppose we know that now well, like the animosity that was kind of growing between them. But it's still kind of funny that like every chance he gets, he's just trying to like poke the bear.
Yeah, he's in Dublin. He's 3,000 miles from America, and he's still, you know, coming out with these one-liners in the handball alley in Croke Park, which is about as far off Broadway as you can get. And that's where he's training, and he sees peppering his performance with put-downs of Joe Frazier, who's, you know, 3,000 miles away, holding on to the world title and not letting it go and not giving him the rematch he so desperately wants.
Yeah, keeping his feet up. Admirable restraint from him, to be fair, to not be like throwing himself into that much action. Like, it's funny, you see now like the wrangling around Croke Park, and if Katie Taylor could ever fight there, was there much difficulties in securing it as a venue back then?
There doesn't seem to be. Like when he first announced it, he just said Dublin, and there was talk about Leopardstown, there was talk about Dalymount Park, there was talk about Lansdowne Road. And then Croke Park just seemed to move to the front because I think it was the largest in terms of capacity, and they had dreams of filling it. And the GA, you know, very cleverly kind of, you know, got into it. And the GA actually criticised, Sean O'Sheacon criticised Buddy afterwards and said the tickets were too expensive. You know, the tickets were too expensive. You priced yourself out of the market. If your tickets were a little bit more, you know, affordable for the Dublin people or the Irish people of, you know, Ireland was a poor country in 1972. Remember that they would have actually filled Croke Park.
Because it's absolutely baffling to me that they didn't. Like, as in, what's your estimate of the attendance on the day?
I think it was 17,000 paid in, and then a few thousand dubs got in for free over Hill 16 in kind of a celebrated moment in Dublin folklore. The Dubliners get into the ring to play the national anthem, which is very, very, you know, culturally significant in itself. And one of the Americans, Albert Lewis's manager or trainer, actually says to me, Don Elbaum, said when they struck up the anthem, he said it was like the signal for the Irish. This was the time to come in, and they invaded over Hill 16.
Because I looked it up earlier, and like there was a Leinster final between Dublin and Laois in 2018 that Dublin won by 18 points, and that allegedly drew more than Muhammad Ali fighting in his prime in Croke Park. I actually just can't get my head around it.
And the other thing is, it was a beautiful night. You know, it was a beautiful night. It was probably the best day of weather in Ireland that summer. Maybe people went to the beach and didn't make it back. But I think the other theory of Harold Conrad's was Ali was too available. Ali was around Dublin too much. If you wanted to see Ali, you got to see Ali. You know, he was literally jogging the roads around South Dublin or around the Dublin mountains. He was walking up and down O'Connell Street, Middle Abbey Street, all of these streets near where we are right now. You know, he went to the movies. John Huston put on a movie for him around here, and so he was visible, and you were within touching distance of him, and that may have stopped people then kind of going into their pockets to splurge for it.
Was there good anecdotes of kind of random people just randomly bumping into him and having like the encounter of their lives?
There's a lovely anecdote about him meeting a street sweeper outside Croke Park in the early hours of the morning when Paddy Monaghan and himself went on a kind of early morning tour of Dublin, where they came down O'Connell Street and they got out and he showed him the pillars outside the GPO, and he gave him a potted history of the Easter Rising. And then they go to Croke Park and there's a street sweeper out there sweeping the streets, and Ali gets out of the car for a chat with the street sweeper and tells him that, you know, chats to him. And Paddy Monaghan's watching the whole thing through the back window of the car, and he's, you know, they just have this interaction. And you think afterwards about the poor street sweeper telling people, yeah, I met Muhammad Ali at 6 o'clock this morning. There was a woman in South County Dublin over by the mountains who basically invited him in for tea and cake. And that to him was one of the highlights of it. Fintan O'Toole's father, Sammy, was working on on the buses, and he pulled up his bus next to Ali and his entourage out jogging in the Wicklow Mountains in the week of the fight. So there was all sorts of ordinary people just happening upon Ali in peculiar circumstances.
And then the attitude was like, I'm okay. I don't need to see the fight.
Well, that may have ultimately hurt the box office.
One of the interesting interactions he had was, I suppose, going to Leinster House, kind of, I suppose oftentimes, as I said, it's kind of a bit of cringe factor when the politicians are elbowing their way to the front. But this is more interesting. Like, he sits down with Jack Lynch, he's talking to Jack Lynch, and I suppose there's a few different versions of what they chatted about. But he was asking about Northern Ireland and getting his head around that. And it seems to be something he was generally interested in or intrigued by. And there's good photos of him sitting down with Jack Lynch and just chatting, I suppose, about world affairs.
There's brilliant photographs of him and Jack Lynch. And the interesting thing is, the backdrop to this fight, like, it's taking place in Dublin, all the action's in Dublin, but Northern Ireland is on fire that week. I mean, the Troubles, it's one of the bloodiest weeks of the year in 1972. There's terrible, terrible things going on in and around Belfast and stuff like that. So that's the backdrop. And then he goes into Leinster House to talk to Jack Lynch, who's the first Western head of state to invite Ali for an official visit, which is one of the only things Ali mentions in his autobiography written with Toni Morrison she was the editor of it actually, in 1976. One of the only things he mentions about Ireland is that Jack Lynch was the first Western head of state to invite him into his office. And then there's all these kind of grubbing TDs launching themselves on him, trying to touch him. If I touch a star, will I twinkle too, kind of thing. And then probably the most amazing thing is that he goes to the Doyle canteen and he eats his dinner at the Doyle canteen.
2 steaks.
Yeah, 2 steaks and vegetables and Coca-Cola. And that was his preparation. That was his preparation for the fight, like that. Obviously, the nutritionists would be appalled at that kind of preparation for any sporting content.
Yeah, he needed his protein. I do enjoy that. I can't remember his name, but the same TD who was like on the tarmac is also, he like elbows his way to the front when he gets to the dolly. He really wanted his moment in the sun.
Timothy Chubb O'Connor was a TD from Kerry who I think was like the Jackie Healy-Rae of the time.
Say no more. Once you said TD from Kerry, I didn't need to hear it.
But he was great friends with Buddy Sugru, but he was a pal of Buddy's, so he was kind of centrally involved in it, and he was trying to organise for Devil Era to host Ali at Ars an Uachtaráin. There was a couple of them, working for that, but that was turned down eventually.
The part about the first Western government inviting him in is an interesting one, because it kind of seems like an obvious thing now. He's such a famous person. Obviously, any politicians would want to meet him, but I suppose he was still more than a little polarizing. And one of the things in the book I find interesting is, I suppose, Ali's kind of surprised that, like, he's looking around, it's like a 99.9% white population adoring him, whereas if that was in America, it would be far, far, far more polarizing. He wouldn't be getting the love he's getting maybe from the Irish crowd when he arrived.
No, I mean, Ireland, he was stunned at how white Ireland was. I mean, Ireland was the whitest country he'd ever visited. And, that was shocking to him. Equally shocking, I think, or equally impactful was how much love he got. And some of the people that I interviewed for the book first time, some of the legendary people like Pete Hamill, the New York author, Jose Torres, former light heavyweight champion of the world, Bud Schulberg, the famous screenwriter of On the Waterfront, they all thought that Dublin, if they were all here that week with Ali, and they thought Dublin affected him. They thought the experience changed him, that he was not able to be as racially polarizing after seeing these white people in Dublin, absolutely worshipping him.
And I mentioned his curiosity in Northern Ireland, because one of the stranger parts of the book or the storylines is, Bernadette Devlin, the civil rights activist, the Northern Ireland politician, who he kind of had a private meeting with when he was in Dublin. But not only that, she was actually in attendance at the Fraser fight, the fight of the century. Every famous person in America wanted to be at this. She had an unbelievable seat at that as well. How did their relationship, what's the genesis of that?
Well, I think what people of my generation, I was born in 1971, we don't understand how big Bernadette Devlin was in America, how famous and infamous she was. She did a tour of America in 1971 where she visited like 50 cities and spoke out and denounced the American government, denounced Nixon, denounced Vietnam, was tremendously brave. It's a wonderful, wonderful story of what she did. And in amongst that, she ends up at the fight because Jimmy Breslin, the famous New York City tabloid journalist, he got her tickets to the Ali and Fraser fight. She was a huge boxing fan. She was a huge Ali fan. And then when he came to Dublin, Paddy Monaghan, I think, was the genesis of that. Paddy Monaghan, mentioned Bernadette Devlin, but Ali knew who she was because everybody in America, she would be on chat shows, evening chat shows in America, debating people. She was very, very well known. So Ali invited her down, and she came down with two men who were running boxing clubs in Ulster. And she told me at the time when I interviewed her back in 2001, she said, he was as interested in the boxing clubs that these men, her future husband was one of the guys, he was as interested in those boxing clubs as he was in anything else, and he gave them as much time as he gave her.
Yeah, it's funny because it's not that surprising, I guess, that he would come to Ireland and there'd be these random meetings with kind of well-known people. It's her being at the fight in New York that I find that hilarious. Like, because as I said, like, you'll probably know some of the star people. I can't think off the top of my head, but it was like Frank Sinatra front row kind of job.
Well, actually, I think it was Frank Sinatra worked as a photographer that night.
Just so he could get in.
Yeah. So no, I mean, it was the fight of the century, and it was, the list of people was incredibly long and star-studded, but she was there, and she's mentioned in the dispatches, like, as one of the, what the American press would call one of the bold-faced names, who was in attendance.
So moving on, I guess there was a few other things they kind of ticked the box of when he was here. Hurling with Eddie Kerr.
Yeah. Hurling with Eddie Kerr was probably one of the most famous photographs, or most famous interactions. You can see, if you travel abroad, especially in America, Irish bars, a lot of them have the pictures of Ali with a hurley, framed up there. It was a brainchild of Raymond Smith, an Irish independent journalist of the time, a real character in his own right. He organised for Eddie Kerr to pop out Doppelmans. Eddie had hurleys in the boot of the car, and off they went.
Yeah, it's funny because I was just like reading quotes from Eddie Kerr now. Like, what an unbelievable moment for him. I know, like, inter-county stars of the day wouldn't probably have gotten the opportunity to rub shoulders. Maybe like now, when a famous person comes to, often in Croke Park, there's a photo op taken. But back then, it would have been extremely unusual.
Yeah, and really organic. Like, can you come out, can you drive out from work? He was working in a bank here in Dublin. Can you drive out and do this thing? Like, there was no, product placement, no branding or anything. It was just like Raymond Smith trying to promote the fight, and I guess trying to promote hurling as well, because it's very interesting, or it's very funny when you read the accounts of Raymond Smith and Eddie Kerr testifying to this. Raymond Smith telling Eddie Kerr, one of the greatest hurlers ever, and certainly probably the greatest hurler of that time, what to do with the hurley to impress Ali.
Well, I think he was impressive. I played a clip earlier in the intro of him saying how impressed he was with the physicality. He'll stick to boxing, as he said. The RTE interview is probably, for me, the highlight almost of the week. Watching it back after reading your book, he has a kind of the guts of an hour with Cathal O'Shannon. And it's like, a lot of people might have seen the Parkinson clips, a very famous interview. It's like Ireland's version of that. And it's just a phenomenal interview. It's not just like asking him, generic boxing questions. There's obviously a little bit of that, like necessary to set the scene, but they get into a really kind of wide-ranging discussion about race, about, American politics. Obviously, that would have been a hot topic at the time. And just watching it back, I'm sure it was interesting for people at the time, but it's almost even more fascinating now because it's like, this is the most famous sports person on the planet. We've seen interviews in the late more recently where it's fairly soft and it's, pretty superficial. Not so in this case. No,
Cathal O'Shannon was a serious journalist. He was a news journalist who, as he said, obviously he's long dead now, but when I interviewed him, he prepared assiduously for this. He read everything he could about Ali, and he was determined to give it his best go. And it is an incredible interview. And I mean, as an Irish person, I am so proud that one of the greatest Ali one-on-ones, I think, of all, and there's a lot of them, is Cathal O'Shannon out in Donnybrook in 1972, going toe-to-toe, literally, with Ali on every topic imaginable.
Yeah, because there was a good yin and yang to the interview. Like, we're going to hear a clip now of him kind of giving not the softer side necessarily, but kind of the more colourful, wittier side of Ali, and this is kind of how the interview began.
You're doing a lot of fighting.
Well, yes, I think the boxing game should stay alive. I think every contender should get a shot at the title. The new champ, Joe Frazier, is not doing nothing, fighting once every 7 months. And fighting people that you could beat. So, and you can't fight, so
You're so right.
I have to keep the game alive because I'm the true champion.
So you see there, obviously, throwing out another Joe Frazier insult, but I suppose that definitely put the crowd, not at ease necessarily, but it was kind of giving the people what they wanted.
Yeah, crowd-pleasing antics were Ali's speciality. And I think it was also the way of Carl O'Shannon's way of softening him up. A spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. You soften up the subject with stuff that that they're going to riff on very easily and enjoy it. And then you come back later with the more serious heavyweight questions.
And they certainly did, because, watching the interview back, it kind of shifts gear a little. Like, Carl O'Shannon's asking him about his upbringing in America and whether he felt kind of a second-class citizen. And he says, growing up as a Negro in America. And Muhammad Ali very quickly, he's like, no, that's not, like, there's no country called Negro. Like, I'm an American, and then they kind of have a bit of a back and forth on that. And then it kind of gets into a wider discussion that we'll hear now, where Carl O'Shannon asked about, I suppose, some of the black Muslim beliefs that he would have been kind of espousing at the time, part of that group. And it's an extraordinary exchange that this took place kind of on RTE it aired the day before Big Fight. So let's hear that now.
Why is it, do you think, that black Muslims preach the separation of the races rather than integration of the races, as indeed many American blacks do?
When we say separation, we know that as of now, we always have to be trading with one another, living with one another. But when we say separate, we mean mainly mentally, as far as do for yourself, help self, clean your own neighborhoods and make them a better place to live, and quit forcing yourself in the white neighborhoods because they're cleaner. Respect your women, pool your resources, education, and qualifications for self-independence. And this is what we mainly teach about the separation. And one day, we believe that black people should trade with one another. We've tried integrating for 400 years, and we've been kicked and shot and brutalized. You read about the news for years, and it's not working. So we believe that we should now come and try to do for ourselves. And I understand this is some of your problem in Ireland, where people are tired of being dominated by certain groups, they're tired of being ruled, and they're men and they want to do for themselves. Same way in all countries. People are just tired and they're revolutionizing things and they want to be free. We've been in America under white domination, lynched, killed, raped, castrated, shot down daily, no justice in the courts, deprived of freedom, justice, and equality, and we just now want to be free, and we can't do it. We have found out that black and white are disagreeable in peace. They can't get along together. So we think we should just now quit fighting, quit being violent. Now that we're doctors, now that we're lawyers, now that we're mechanics, now that we're educated, we're not needed to pick cotton no more. You got millions of blacks been born every day in hospitals. There are no jobs. We think that we should now go on some land and build and construct and do for ourselves. That's all.
So I'd love to know Carl O'Shannon's thinking going into this. He would have obviously talked to him, like did he envisage it being kind of that kind of interview, or what did he think?
Well, I think Carl O'Shannon's motivation was, I'm going to get him to answer the difficult questions, because, and it's shocking when you read some of the stuff Ali said, because, what I think makes him the most fascinating character in the history of sport is he was very radical. He said some lunatic things. He said some incredibly extreme stuff, especially at that kind of phase in his life. The white man is the devil, preaching racial separatism ideologies. And Carl O'Shannon, as a news journalist, as opposed to a sports journalist, and I say this as a sports journalist, he was going to go harder. He was going to ask him more difficult questions, and he was going to pin him on some of this stuff and get him to actually try to explain it. And that's what makes the interview great. The substance of it, they got down into it about this stuff. And as I said, when you read back a lot of the Ali stuff, there was a lot. He was a complex character, and there was no black and white. If you pardon the pun, there was a lot of grey areas. He said a lot of offensive stuff, as well as a lot of inspirational things. And O'Shannon, as a quote unquote real news journalist, would not let him away with that.
Would he have been pressed on those matters on American television? I wouldn't have seen as many.
Probably at the time, yeah. Okay. I mean, you wouldn't be on American late night shows today, but the American late night shows of the 60s and 70s were much more hard edged, and you'd have Norman Mailer threatening to punch somebody, and that kind of.
It's not Jimmy Fallon.
Yeah, it would not be Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel or any of that kind of soft soap stuff and soft soap kind of entertainment razzmatazz. It would have been much more hard edged kind of material. But, this is what makes Ali who he is. He went through different... And it's also why, as somebody living in America, when I talk to older Americans, A lot of them don't like Ali. You know, a lot of them don't like Ali, and there's a lingering resentment of Ali among some Americans from Vietnam and from some of the stuff that he said in the more radical phases of his career. I mean, he did evolve, and he became like America's beloved grandfather in the last 15, 20 years of his life, especially after the Atlanta Olympics. But before that, a lot of people resented him and associated him with stuff that they did not want any part of.
Well, you kind of get to see that side of it in this interview. That's why it's such a well-rounded chat, and I encourage people to go on. It's about 45 minutes or so on YouTube. It really is a fascinating chat, and the fact that this was aired the day before and recorded 2 days before the fight, for some reason, makes it even more interesting that he would take, like, not like anyone would do that now, and take the time out of their schedule to sit down in the television studio.
And he had a cold. And Angelo Dundee did not want him there, and they had a technical breakdown in the middle of the interview, which is the absolute nightmare, obviously, for something like this. And Dundee just wanted him back out of the studio because he's sitting there under hot lights, battling a cold. You know, it's a nightmare in terms of preparation for the fight. But Ali loved that stuff. I mean, that stuff was oxygen to him.
Obviously, the week was entirely about Muhammad Ali, which is understandable, but maybe you can give us a flavour of Al Blue Lewis. His story is really interesting as well. Like, he spent time in jail for like killing someone in a fight, basically. Seemed to have been released because he was like a mediator during a prison riot and helped to kind of bring it to a close. It seems like straight out of a movie script, and then obviously is chosen as the opponent and, you know, makes his way to Dublin. A very interesting character.
Tremendous character and a lovely man. You know, I met him late in his life. He lived in 8 Mile in Detroit, and when I went to meet him, I called him up and he said, "I'll come to your apartment." He said, "No, you'll meet me at my doctor's office." And we did it in the back room of his doctor's office because he thought that would be the safest place for me, because it was a tough part of Detroit that he grew up in and that he lived in, but an absolute gentleman. The week in Dublin was the highlight of Al Blue Lewis's career. It was, as he said, looking back, it was like a week when I was somebody, you know, and he was treated so well, and Dublin was so novel to him. Like, he went jogging outside of Dublin and he saw cows, and he'd never seen cows before, and he was fascinated. And at night he would stay up looking out the window. It was Dublin in July, and he couldn't believe how light it was, how late in the evening. So he was kind of a fish out of water, kind of culture shock, but a man who really, really enjoyed it and spoke so lovingly and so warmly of the experience he had and how he was treated by everybody in Dublin, which, again, he was coming out of Detroit, tough town, coming out of racially divided America. He was also impressed with how, you know, the white Ireland, as we might call it, how this white country treated him, and you know, so nicely for the duration of his stay.
Yeah, I think I'm remembering this detail correctly. I didn't write this one down, but did he get paid like £1,000 to have like advertisement on his shorts?
Yes.
And that seemed, I felt like, good for Al Blue Lewis. Like, I was delighted to see that he got, that's a lot of money, I presume, in 1972, and I just felt good for him that he got kind of a little bit of a
Moulinex, the kitchen appliance manufacturers, they paid him the money, and it was a big payday for Al Blue Lewis, who was this guy. When you go through his career, he should have gotten more breaks than he did, but he got started late because he was in prison for manslaughter, killing somebody when he was a teenager, getting released because of that. So he had a kind of remarkable career of his own, and he became a trainer actually later on in life.
Yeah, it's a cool part of the book when you meet him and kind of get to hear from himself at the end. Like, there's something about like the old fighter, like, that's very cinematic, and you can kind of picture the meeting. Oh no,
and there's no, you know, I mean, any sports writer will tell you, like, boxers just are the best interviews because they always have the most interesting stories. They led the most incredible lives. Even journeyman boxers like Al Blue Lewis was a sparring partner for Ali in Miami. And they were hanging out in a hotel room in 1970 when the KKK delivered a decapitated dog to Ali's room. And it was Al Blue Lewis who actually went to the door and collected this box, and they thought it was cake, and it turned out to be a dog with its head chopped off. And the message said, you know, you called Ali a draft dodging dog, and warned him not to go to Atlanta to fight his comeback fight.
Yeah, so that shows you the time they were fighting at the time. The fight day itself, you know, we were talking earlier about it, maybe it didn't sell as well. I couldn't get over that it took place on a Wednesday. I'm like, doesn't seem to me, I'm not a promotional expert, I'm not a boxing promoter, but Saturday prime time is traditionally when big fights take place, not on a Wednesday in the summer in Dublin.
Well, all I would say to that is Buddy Sugroup's his first time out as a major promoter, and it was the day of the fight, remember, when Barney Eastwood, who was involved, obviously we all know Barney Eastwood later from the Barry McGuigan years, but Barney Eastwood was at a meeting and said, where are the gloves? And somebody said, we don't have gloves. At which point Barney Eastwood called a jockey friend of his in London to hightail it to the British Boxing Board of Control, get actual championship gloves, jump on a plane to Dublin and get to Croke Park so the fight could start. So the undercard started late because the gloves hadn't arrived from London, because nobody had thought that they would need gloves for this fight. So as a promotion, having it on a Wednesday night, bad business decision, absolutely, but totally in character for this entire event.
And do we think there might have been like a hurling or Gaelic football clash at the weekend, maybe? Is that potentially?
Well, you're exposing my lack of research, Will, and I did not look up that detail, and perhaps I should have.
That's funny, because that's the one thing I was like, why a Wednesday? I was like, as the guys are lamenting their lost earnings, I'm like, I have one bit of advice for you guys: Saturday. But obviously, there must have been a reason why that was taking place. Was it a good fight? Like, so after all the Ali in Dublin, the build-up, the RTE interviews, were people, the few who did pay, was it a decent fight? Obviously, Ali would have been majorly favoured, but
it was okay. It wasn't as bad as some people make out, but it really was fairly lackluster. Ali was going through the motions. He had to be careful because Al Blue Lewis was dangerous. He was a dangerous puncher, and that's always, there's always the chance of an upset. He was battling a cold. So people can watch it on YouTube, or it was on YouTube quite up to recently. It's lackluster. I mean, to me, in the story of the week, the fight's the least interesting thing. The fight is, to me, it's like Ali in Dublin causing absolute havoc. The most famous athlete on earth, the most famous African-American on earth in this white country, being absolutely adored everywhere he goes, and discovering this kind of weird and wonderful land that was Ireland in 1972.
And as you say, there was like kind of an invasion of people once the fight started. And then once the fight ended, was it, I think, a technical knockout in the 11th round, kind of a pitch invasion, as if there's been an All-Ireland final victory. And all of a sudden, like Ali, if you thought he was swarmed earlier in the week.
Yeah, Ali was not allowed to leave the ring, which leads to, another famous kind of Dublin folklore moment. Ali is bursting to get to the toilet, and Angela Dundee's worried about him. And he's standing there, and the Dublin fans have basically crowded the ring. There's all of them are climbing into the ring. There's all sorts of craziness. And then, somebody gets the mic and says, please, will you let Mohammed go to the dressing room? And a Dublin voice shouts out, no, let the dressing room come to Mohammed.
And it's funny, like, so that was the end of the fight. Is he spend much more time in Dublin? Is he whisked off and gone straight away?
Ali was gone to London for a connecting flight the next morning. The novelty of Ireland wore off. He spoke to a couple of New York journalists, I think it was the day before the fight, and it was like, I'm getting out of here. We could postpone this because of my cold, but I want to get out of here now. I've had enough,
Yeah, but it's funny, like, what kind of, I suppose once he left, were people hailing this as a great week? Were people talking about the ticket sales? Like, what was the feeling at the time in the media or among the general population, would you say?
Oh, I think Buddy Sugar got a lot of criticism, and I thought it was unfair, and even the first version of this book that I wrote, maybe I didn't give Buddy enough credit, and I don't think the media in Dublin, they were like, pointing out what a financial disaster it had been, and I think it was like, you got to put it in context. They
got Ali to Ireland, like, cut them on some slack.
In 1972, when, making an international phone call was an enormous ordeal, transferring money between countries was so difficult. And this guy didn't have very much money, and yet somehow, and like when you look at Ali's resume on BoxRec or one of these websites, and you go down through all the cities, and then you just suddenly see Dublin, and you're like, he got Ireland an entry on the most famous resume in boxing history, and it's all there because of this 5'6" pint-sized strongman from Kerry who had a lunatic idea that he pulled off, albeit with financially disastrous consequences.
That's why I think this book, it's so great that it's been re-released, because it's a story that people might be aware of, they might not be, but it's such a cool week and like a kind of a slice of history that we have the most famous sports person, one of the most famous people in the world at the time, walking around the streets, as you say, very accessible, so much so that people didn't even feel they needed to see the fight. I just think it's a very cool thing, if that's not too uncool of a word to use.
No, it's fantastic. And the pictures of Ali, the pictures, the pictures of Ali from that time in Dublin, and you're like, there he is, like the most famous boxer ever, probably the most important American athlete in history. And there he is, like in the wild in Dublin, causing all sorts of, havoc and mayhem everywhere he went. And it also is, I hope, offers a window into a different Ireland. Like the Ireland of 1972 is unimaginable for us today. Like that was such a different time, such a a chaotic, undeveloped country. Like we hadn't entered the European Union yet. We really were, very, very backward, and we hadn't made the great leap forward that we would in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, just before you wrap up, is there anything else of that week you feel is worth mentioning to people that might not be aware of it? I tried to cover as much of it as I can, but anything in particular that stands out to you that we haven't touched on?
I love the fact that the ring came from the Edenderry Boxing Club, which was a disused shoe factory in Edenderry, County Offaly, that was brought up by the Brereton brothers, who were a famous boxing family in Edenderry. And, there's Muhammad Ali boxing on a ring that was for like the kids of Edenderry to box on normally, because yet again, Buddy hadn't organised a ring. So, they were going to bring a ring down from the RUC base. That was politically problematic. There was a British Army ring also under consideration from the north. That was problematic. So in the end, they ended up with a ring that came from Edenderry, County Offaly, from the local boxing club. And when the fight was over, they went back to Edenderry, and the kids in Edenderry were bouncing around the same ring as Muhammad Ali a few nights later.
Well, one of the many colourful stories in the book. I'd encourage people this weekend to do a deep dive. Go on YouTube, watch the RTE interview, and of course buy the book, The Big Fight When Ali Conquered Ireland, by Dave Hannigan. Dave, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me, Will. Really appreciate it.